According to the CDC, in the past few months, people felt exhausted about 10 to 15% of the time. And I'm not talking about physical exhaustion after a workout. I'm talking about actual exhaustion from sleep deprivation. And the thing is that that number could be a lot higher than that because a lot of people tend to underestimate how tired they actually are. There's actually been plenty of studies where they do memory tests and cognitive tests, and they compare people who are sleep deprived versus not sleep deprived. And in surveys afterwards of people who were sleep deprived, they tend to say that they were just fine or that they didn't have any sort of impairment. But when you look at their results, you can definitely see that their sleep deprivation drastically reduced their performance. And it's kind of similar to someone who's extremely drunk and they're trying to drive home and trying to convince you that they're able to drive when it's so obvious that they cannot. So right now, a lot of people are chronically tired, and most people are in a state of chronic sleep deprivation. And this is really common in developed nations. Out of all the developed nations in the world, 2/3 of people are not getting the required amount of sleep every night. And a lot of times when you ask someone how they slept last night, their answer won't be good. Either they'll say that they didn't sleep long enough, or their sleep quality just sucked for one reason or another, or it was a combination of the two. The good thing is that there are some very simple and natural ways to start improving your sleep. And these are ways that do not involve any sleeping pills and actually work a lot better than sleeping pills and will actually start improving your breathing when you're sleeping and actually improve how long you're sleeping. One of the biggest problems is a lot of people do not take their sleep seriously. And a lot of people think it's normal to not sleep enough or to not have that good quality of sleep. And they think it's normal to wake up every day feeling groggy or have that brain fog. What most people need to understand is sleep is not something that is negotiable. Sleep is something that has persisted throughout all of evolution and something that all animals do. So to say that humans can neglect some of their sleep or that having bad sleep quality is normal is absolute BS. Now you might ask, first of all, how much sleep do we actually need? Well, for most people, it's going to be 8 hours. And for a lot of you watching this, you might be thinking, well, I can get by just fine with 6 hours. Well, I can tell you that there have been countless studies where even people who regularly sleep 6 hours, when they induce more sleep in people and they start getting them to sleep a little bit longer, that all of their cognitive tests, their memory tests, all start to improve. So just because you feel fine with however much sleep you're getting, if it's less than 8 hours, chances are that you can be doing even better if you sleep more. Now, that's not going to be true for everybody. Some people actually don't need 8 hours of sleep. Some people can actually survive just fine and have no impairment with just 6 hours of sleep. Now, the only people that can know this for sure are people who take a genetic test because it's a variant of one specific gene that allows people to function just fine with 6 hours of sleep. Now, before you go out and say that, oh, that's probably me because I can function just fine with 6 hours of sleep, know that this is very, very rare. Actually, you're more likely to get struck by lightning than to have this very specific variant. So for the vast majority of you, and that is basically almost 100% of people, you are not going to be fine when you deprive yourself of sleep. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's fine, but it's really hard to get 8 hours of sleep. Even if I try to sleep 8 hours, I just can't do it. So a lot of people struggle with this too. So I'm going to go over a lot of how to improve your sleep quality and also start sleeping longer. So make sure you stick around till the end. So one of the best ways to actually start improving your sleep is to stop taking any sleeping medication. Now, obviously you want to talk to your doctor and make sure, especially if this is something that was prescribed, to make sure that this is something that you're okay doing. But if you look at any study on people who are sleeping with a sleeping aid like a sleeping pill versus natural sleep, that sleeping pill will not induce anything close to natural sleep. Now, sleeping pills are just getting more and more common. In 2010, about 6 to 10 Americans would take hypnotics to help improve their sleep. And reports are showing now that about 1 in 5 Americans are regularly taking sleeping medications. Now, hypnotic drugs are drugs that are usually prescribed to help treat something like insomnia. Insomnia is basically a condition where people have trouble falling and staying asleep. The problem is that these sleeping pills do not induce natural sleep, and they actually make your sleep quality worse. In fact, there's not a single sleeping pill out there that will induce natural sleep. And that's even when you include the more modern sleeping medications. Now, what exactly happens when you take a sleeping pill? It may look like you start to get sleepy and go to sleep, But I'm going to put that sleep in some air quotes because what you're seeing is not actually what's happening in your brain. It's actually more of a sedative that's happening to you, and you're not getting that natural sleep, especially when you look at the brain waves of someone on a sleeping pill. So sleeping pills are sedatives, and they actually target the same area in the brain that alcohol does, because both alcohol and sleeping pills are under that class of sedatives. And we already know that people who drink alcohol have terrible sleep, and they get a lot less REM sleep, they get a lot less deep sleep, and their sleep quality just sucks, and they wake up the next day feeling really crappy. Now, if you compare the brain activity of someone who's naturally asleep versus someone who's under a sleeping pill like Ambien, you can see that that brain activity is very different. There was actually a study where they took people who were taking these sleeping pills and they compared them to people who were naturally sleeping, and they compared their brain waves. They found that they were not getting the deepest part of their brain waves in the sleep studies. So basically, they weren't getting as much deep sleep. Now, one major benefit we get from natural sleep is improvements in our memory. So especially if we just learned something, our natural sleep is actually able to take our memory from our short-term storage in our brain and make these connections with our cortex, which is the outer region of our brain, and turn these short-term memories into long-term memories. Not only does that help solidify our memories, it also helps clear out our short-term storage to make room to learn new things as soon as we wake up. But if you're on a sleeping pill, for example, like Ambien, you do not get these benefits. And researchers from the University of Pennsylvania were actually studying this. So this study was done on animals, but these researchers compared two different groups. So one group, they gave these animals a weight-appropriate dose of this Ambien, and the other group, they just gave a placebo. And basically what they did is before they went to sleep, they induced learning in these animals. And they were studying their brain waves and their brain activity while they were sleeping. The animals that were naturally sleeping, they could actually see their brain rewiring and helping form those new memories and solidify those memories of what they just learned. But they saw the exact opposite in the animals that were taking the Ambien. Not only did these animals fail to solidify those new memories, the Ambien actually actively weakened new memories. These animals actually had a 50% reduction in the memories that they formed initially when they had the learning. So to me, it just doesn't make any sense. And I think most people will not benefit at all. They'll actually just be harming themselves when they take these sleeping medications. And you'll find that there are a lot of alternatives out there that can naturally help improve your sleep. And this is not to mention the multiple side effects that people get when they take these sleeping medications. So some of the side effects from these sleeping medications are daytime grogginess and forgetfulness, and also slower reaction times, which can affect other motor skills, like even their driving. And actually, people who take these sleeping medications, they're at a higher risk of getting in car accidents and also falling. And it sort of turns into this never-ending cycle, because now the next day comes and you're tired and groggy and you want to take those sleeping medications again. Or you're going to reach for that cup of coffee throughout the day, which is also going to affect your sleep. We're going to talk about that more later, but the coffee is also going to negatively affect your sleep. Now, another problem you get with these sleeping medications is something called rebound insomnia. Basically what that is after you stop these sleeping medications for a short period of time, you're going to have a harder time falling and staying asleep. And the reason for this is just like any drug, your brain will start to get dependent on it. Because anything that's going on in your brain, any wiring or any drug that comes in, your brain is used to a certain dose. When you start taking these medications, your brain starts to get used to these higher and higher doses of this medication being there. And when you stop taking these, now your brain is wondering where all that medication is. This is basically a natural response your brain does to any sort of chemical or any sort of drug, because your brain will start to get less and less sensitive the higher and higher dose of something that's there. This is how your brain will fight off any foreign chemical or foreign drug. This is pretty much what the withdrawal process will look like from like alcohol or any sort of drug. So when you stop taking these sleeping medications, your body's going through this withdrawal, and that's what makes your sleep really crappy at first. And if you look at any of those sleeping pills that are out in the market now, most of them are in the class of addictive substances. Now you might be wondering, well, what about all the people that say they sleep so much better when they're taking a sleeping medication? Well, I find that hard to believe, and I think that a lot of the results from sleeping medications are more subjective. And there was actually a study kind of showing this. This study was a meta-analysis, and they were comparing 65 different studies where they were comparing a placebo versus a sleeping medication. And all of the studies that they were looking at were randomized, double-blind, controlled studies. So this is basically the highest level of evidence that we can get, and we have a ton of evidence behind this. Now, it's really important to compare something to a placebo because this will help us show the actual response to a drug. Because if you get the same effect when you're comparing a placebo to an active drug, then you're going to start to question it a little bit because the placebo has no active properties. And if that's also getting the same effect, like if that's also improving your sleep, then you know that there has to be something else going on than just that drug is going to do. So when you look through all this data and all these studies, they found that when they compare people who take sleeping medications versus people who take a placebo, they did find that people who take those sleeping medications were able to fall asleep faster. But really, that's about it. They also found that there was really no difference in how soundly they stayed asleep throughout the night. And what the researchers concluded from looking at all the studies was that the benefits that you get from sleeping medications are basically very small and of questionable importance at best. So basically, there's no real evidence of any benefits you get from taking these sleeping medications. Now, another reason I'm so against taking these sleeping medications is a lot of the other harm it can be doing to your body. So there was another study in the British Medical Journal, and it was showing how sleeping medications can potentially increase your risk of dying and getting cancer. What they found is people who receive these hypnotic prescriptions have over a 3 times higher risk of dying compared to regular people. And this is even when they're prescribed less than 18 pills a year. Now, there was a dose dependency as well. So that means that people who were prescribed even more pills had an even higher risk of dying. And also they had a higher risk of getting cancer. So people who were in the top third of the amount of prescriptions that they were getting, they had about a 35% increased risk in getting a new type of cancer. And this study also included the newer sleeping medications and even the really popular one, Ambien, that we've been talking about. Now, does this mean that all hypnotic pills will cause you to start dying earlier and to get cancer? Well, no, it could be some other type of mechanism going on. It also could be the other way around, that people who take these sleeping medications are already at the point where they're more likely to die or to get cancer. But it could also very likely be true that these sleeping medications do cause cancer and do increase your risk of dying. And to me, I just don't see any benefit in taking these pills. And if there's all these associated risks with it, I don't know why anyone would do it, unless there's really no other option for them. And if you look at all the studies, there is absolutely no evidence that these sleeping pills will help induce better sleep and even, like some people claim, help save lives. They don't do that. Now, I want to actually start talking about ways to improve your sleep quality that do not involve any sort of medication. And one of the biggest ways to actually improve your sleep quality is by changing your breathing. One really common sleep problem that has really often gotten undiagnosed is something called sleep disordered breathing. And an example of sleep disordered breathing is sleep apnea. This is basically any sort of condition that affects your ability to breathe normally when you're sleeping. And sleep apnea is a condition where people are basically waking up multiple times throughout the night because they have some sort of obstruction in their airway or obstruction in their ability to breathe. So they're waking up constantly throughout the night because their body stops breathing, and then they wake up gasping for air to get that oxygen back in their body. Now, you might be surprised, but these breathing problems can happen a lot in kids, and this is called pediatric sleep disordered breathing. This is actually a major problem right now, and I don't think it's being talked about nearly enough. So a couple things that will characterize sleep disordered breathing, it doesn't just have to be sleep apnea, it's even snoring or very loud breathing. These are not normal things, and if someone tells you that it's normal, they don't know what they're talking about. So one thing that really puts kids and even adults at a higher risk of having breathing issues, especially when they're sleeping, is being a regular mouth breather. That is regularly breathing through your mouth instead of your nose. Now, estimates are right now that about 50% of kids are regular mouth breathers. And I can tell you right now in my practice where I see a lot of kids, I could see that number even being up to 70% of kids. Now, one problem that mouth breathing causes, especially if you start off by mouth breathing as a kid, is it can cause a lot of problems with your jaw development and your airway or your breathing development as you get older. Because people who are regular mouth breathers, they tend to have really narrow, constricted jaws, especially as their jaws are developing. Because your jaw is actually meant to grow wide and forward. So the way it does this is normally people will be having their mouth closed at all times of rest. So their lips will be closed and their tongue will be touching the roof of their mouth. And that is basically what we call proper oral posture. So that is the correct position of how your mouth should be at rest. And when your mouth is in this position, your tongue will kind of stimulate your palate or the roof of your mouth to grow forward and wide. Now, this only happens when you keep your tongue against the roof of your mouth. Instead, if your tongue is not touching the roof of your mouth, like someone who's a regular mouth breather, their tongue is going to be at the floor of their mouth. And their mouth is going to be hanging open, their lips are going to be open. And what happens instead is their face tends to grow longer instead of wider. And this will keep everything really narrow and constricted. So their palate or their jaws will be narrow. And this will also constrict their throat and their breathing. So they're going to have a lot harder time breathing air compared to a normal person. And this will also cause their teeth to grow in crooked, because when you have instead a wider and more forward growing jaw, how it's supposed to be growing, then all your teeth will come in the right place. And if you look at history, if you look at before industrialization, all of our ancestors had straight teeth. Even their wisdom teeth will come in the right place and they will use them. If you think about it, why is it that almost everyone, it's so normal for them to lose their wisdom teeth? Our body doesn't just make things to make it difficult for us to lose them eventually. We needed those wisdom teeth. And it wasn't that long ago where our wisdom teeth were regularly being used. But if you look at now, almost everyone has their crooked teeth and they have these wisdom teeth that need to come out and they need to get these braces to help straighten their teeth. The reason all this is happening is a couple things. And one of the major ones is regularly breathing through your mouth. Now, the second reason this is happening, I'm not going to get into too much detail on this because I did talk about this in a different podcast. The second reason is a change in our diet. So before industrialization, as a kid, we would start eating harder foods from an earlier age. As soon as we would start teething from the age of about 6 months onwards, we would be eating harder foods and we'd spend a lot of the time chewing throughout the day. This would help develop our jaw muscles and help strengthen our jaws and help them grow wide and forward. And this is also what helps someone regularly become a nose breather instead of a mouth breather, because as your jaw goes forward and wide and your tongue is naturally resting against the roof of your mouth, then your mouth is going to always be closed and you're always going to be breathing through your nose. Instead, with a change in diet that happened in industrialization, so this is more in the last 1,000 years or so, people started eating softer foods and they didn't use their jaw muscles as much anymore. And you can see rapid change in history. If you look at before industrialization, if you look at any records of any fossil records, and you compare that to fossil records now, you can see that the jaws have gotten a lot smaller, teeth have gotten a lot more crooked, and people have become more and more mouth breathers. Now, again, I'm not going to get into too much detail on this, but people who are regular mouth breathers now, they're going to be at a higher risk of having breathing disorders, higher risk of getting asthma, higher risk of having to get their tonsils and adenoids removed, and higher risk of sleep apnea. And also they're going to be more likely to be chronically tired because they're not sleeping well. And also them being chronically tired will mimic the symptoms of ADHD. So now they may be mistakenly put on a medication to treat their ADHD when really the source of the problem is they're not sleeping well. So that's just a little bit of background, and I didn't go into a whole lot of detail. I did talk about that more in a different podcast. Like I said, I'll put a link in the description below where you can learn more about that. But I want you to understand is that sleep disordered breathing and mouth breathing are both terrible things that are affecting our society today. And whether you're a child or an adult, either way, this is going to cause a state of chronic sleep deprivation, and it's not something that's going to correct itself on its own. And now we're starting to really get some evidence where people actually did studies on comparing mouth breathing and nasal breathing. So there was one study that was looking at 12 healthy people, and it was looking at their airway resistance when they were breathing through their mouth versus breathing through their nose. So basically their airway resistance is how hard it is for them to get air to go into their lungs. So what they found is when these people were asleep, their airway resistance was much higher when they were mouth breathing versus when they were nose breathing. So when they looked at these people and they had them start breathing through their mouth instead of their nose, they also found that their sleep quality got a lot worse. And they also turned these people from not having any sort of sleep apnea to having very severe sleep apnea. So when the people started breathing through their mouth, they had an AHI score, which is a sleep apnea score, of 43. So that means that within just 1 hour, these people would stop breathing and their brains would force them to wake up. That was happening 43 times an hour compared to barely happening at all before this study even happened. Now, the sad thing is that this is exactly how a lot of people right now are breathing every single night. Now, imagine you having to wake up like this every single night. Even after sleeping 8 hours, you can see that your sleep quality was so bad that you're still going to wake up really tired and really exhausted. Luckily, there are some ways to actually fix this, especially if this is happening to you. I know we've all heard of a CPAP machine, but there are some other ways and probably easier ways as well. And they basically involve improving the use of your nose when you're breathing. So in a nutshell, the two things that you're going to want to start to do are, one, using what's called a nasal dilator, which is basically a strip that goes over your nose. And there's also an internal dilator, which will go on inside of your nose. And basically what it's doing is just opening up your nose a little bit to help you breathe properly through your nose. The second thing you want to use is a mouth tape to prevent you from breathing through your mouth in the middle of the night. Now, the thing is that let's say you didn't have sleep apnea and you were a regular mouth breather. You still want to be using your nose. And the reason is there's even evidence that simply not being able to use your nose properly could be just as bad as having severe sleep apnea. So we know one of the major problems with sleep apnea is that you're waking up multiple times in the middle of the night struggling to breathe. But another problem with sleep apnea is it actually leads to metabolic problems in your body, which is basically all the different reactions that go on in your body. And these problems can actually lead to different diseases, and one of them being heart disease. And it actually does this through something called oxidative stress. Oxidative stress is basically when you have this excess or this abundance of something called reactive oxygen species. And these things can cause a lot of havoc to your body because they can start damaging your cells, and these will contribute to all sorts of diseases. So there was a study that was looking at how much oxidative stress you get in 3 different groups. So one of the groups had very severe sleep apnea, the other group had mild sleep apnea, and they were heavy snorers, and the third group had no sleep apnea, but they did have a nasal impairment. And this study also controlled for a lot of different factors like age, their sex, their BMI, etc. And the way that they were measuring their oxidative stress was by doing something called a skin prick test. And they found that no matter which group you were in, every single group had the same amount of oxidative stress throughout the night. So that means even someone who was either very severe sleep apnea or someone who had no sleep apnea but just had trouble breathing through their nose, they both had an equal amount of oxidative stress throughout the night. And what the researchers concluded was that simply the nose can play a big factor in the pathogenesis or the diseases that come from sleep apnea by the production of oxidative stress. So sleep apnea doesn't just cause you to keep waking up and ruin your sleep. It also contributes to a bunch of different diseases. And now we're finding out that simply not being able to breathe through your nose can do the same thing as well. So this is why my major focus is going to be for you to improve your ability to breathe through your nose. Now, luckily, there are ways you can improve your ability to breathe through your nose at home without any sort of surgery. So there was a study and they took people who had moderate sleep apnea and they wanted to see how they could improve their sleep by using a nasal dilator and also a nasal decongestant spray. So it's basically a spray you put in your nose to help open your nose up a little bit, and then they would put a nasal dilator strip over their nose. And they basically split the study up into 2 groups. So one group just had a placebo, so both the strip and the nasal spray weren't doing anything, and the other group was the actual study. So the group that had the placebo, they had about 39% oral breathing throughout the night. So throughout the night, 39% of the time they were breathing through their mouth. Now the other group, the group that used the nasal decongestant spray and the nasal strip, had only 8% mouth breathing throughout the night. So their mouth breathing dropped from 39% to 8%. And also they improved their sleep apnea. So their AHI score, again, their sleep apnea score, it dropped by about 12 on average. Now, you don't have to know exactly what that means. All you got to know is these people were either moved from moderate sleep apnea to a very mild sleep apnea, or they were cured entirely. So that's the first thing you can do. The first thing you can do any night, this can help anybody, is using a nasal decongestant spray and putting a nasal dilator over your nose. Very simple thing to do. Now, the second thing that I talked about is using a mouth tape, and we have studies on that as well. So this study took 20 people that had mild sleep apnea, and they had them take a sleep test before the study and also a week after they were using a mouth tape while sleeping. And they found that 65% of the people had a significant improvement in their sleep apnea. And on average, their AHI scores went from 8.3 to 4.7. So basically, there was a 47%, almost a 50% reduction in the amount of times that they were waking up in the middle of the night struggling to breathe. And also using this mouth tape improved their snoring quite a bit. So that doesn't just mean that they were much less annoying to sleep around, that also means that they were sleeping a lot better. Now, before you go and start taping your mouth shut every night, you want to make sure that you can actually tolerate this first. That means that you want to make sure that you can actually breathe through your nose properly first. So I recommend doing this during the day first. So you can do this in about 10-minute increments, and you probably want to make sure you're not around other people when you do this, but just tape your mouth shut and see if you can tolerate that for 10 minutes at a time. Now, if you're someone that you know that you cannot do this at all, or you tried it and you can't tolerate breathing through your nose, or you tried doing it during nighttime and you wake up with that mouth tape on the side of your face, or you ripped it off because you couldn't handle breathing through your nose, another thing you can try is a nose unblocking exercise. And what you first want to do is use that nasal spray just to open up your nose and clear out your nose a little bit first. You might want to even take an allergen if you have a lot of allergies. But the nose unblocking exercise is basically, you're going to be taking a normal inhale and exhale through your nose. So you're going to hold your mouth shut and do that. So you're going to go, and after that exhale, you're going to hold your nose and keep your mouth shut, and you're going to start bobbing your head back and forth for as long as you can until you have kind of a medium to strong urge to breathe. So it's going to look kind of like this. And I'm going to keep doing that until I have a medium to strong urge to breathe, and then I'm going to recover by breathing through my nose for 1 minute. So after the bobbing my head back and forth, and I'll just recover by only breathing through my nose for 1 minute. I'm going to repeat that exercise 6 times. Now, you can also do this by walking instead of bobbing your head back and forth. So if you have if you're walking on a track or something, or if you're going on a walk, you can do the same thing. Take a normal inhale, exhale through your nose. And after the exhale, just hold your nose shut and start walking in as many paces as you can until you have that medium to strong urge to breathe. And then again, you're going to recover for 1 minute by breathing through your nose, and then you're going to repeat this about 6 times. Now, the trick with this is you want to get that medium to strong urge to breathe. You don't want to wait until you absolutely are dying to take the next breath, because then you're going to ruin the exercise. So a simple trick to make sure that you're doing this right is after you're done holding your breath, you should only have to take 1 to 2 deeper breaths to recover and go back to normal breathing. After those 1 to 2 deeper breaths, you should just have to do regular breathing for that minute of recovery. And then you can do that next round and repeat from there. Now, the way I'd recommend doing this is do this exercise multiple times. So do it during the daytime and also do it before you go to sleep. And then also, I'd recommend using that nasal dilator strip and then putting that mouth tape on after you're done with the exercise. Because once your nose is open, it's really rare that it'll clog again. Because once you start using your nose more, that's when your nose will stay open. Instead, if you're keeping your nose dormant and you're only breathing through your mouth, that's going to keep all that mucus built up in your nose. So you want to make sure that you keep using your nose consistently, and that'll help keep it open. Now, if you tried this, if you tried the whole exercise, if you tried the nasal spray, and you tried the nasal dilator, and you tried the exercise, and you tried the mouth tape, and you still cannot tolerate breathing through your nose, now it might be time to go see an ENT, because this is the point where you might need some sort of surgery done to help you breathe through your nose properly. But you don't want to neglect this, because it is not normal for you to never be able to breathe through your nose. If that is the case, then you definitely want to address it. Now, with that being said, I want to move on to another topic to help improve your sleep quality. And that's going to be your sleep temperature, or the actual temperature of your sleep environment. Controlling your temperature is one of the best ways to help improve your sleep. But the problem is that this is really often overlooked. A lot of people don't seem to understand how big of a difference changing your temperature or that thermostat will do. So you might not have noticed this, but it's usually easier to fall asleep and stay asleep when it's a little too cold versus when it's a little too hot. And the reason is, to successfully initiate sleep, our body temperature has to drop about 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 1 degree Celsius. And you might also be surprised to find that the ideal room temperature for most people is going to be about 65 degrees Fahrenheit. You might think that's extremely cold, but I'm going to get into why that is the optimal temperature. So one way to actually control your core body temperature is going to be by changing the temperature on the surface of your skin. And if you want to know the best places to actually help control your body temperature, it's going to be 3 areas on your body. It's going to be your feet, your hands, and your head. Those are the 3 areas of our body where most of our thermal work is being done. So if you change the body temperature on those 3 key areas, that's going to help the most to help control your core body temperature. So if you ever wondered why when kids are tucked in so neatly under their sheets and they look like a perfect model kid when they're sleeping, but when they wake up, their hands and their feet are out of the blanket, it's usually because they're naturally trying to control their core body temperature to help them get to that lower core body temperature to fall asleep quicker. Now, you might be wondering why we need to sleep in a colder environment and why our body core temperature drops when we're sleeping. Well, this is exactly how humans evolved. So human sleeping patterns actually evolved on the eastern parts of Africa. And if you look at these areas, they actually have pretty extreme fluctuations in their temperature throughout a single day. So in the winter, their temperatures will change about 14 degrees in a single day. And in the summer, it'll change about 12 degrees throughout the day. But now, if we fast forward, our temperatures are kind of controlled. So if we're inside all day, we have this constant thermostat temperature where our temperature never really changes. So if we go before all this AC stuff, our temperature in the winter would change 14 degrees throughout a single day. And that's how we were evolved. But now there is hardly any fluctuation in our temperature. And don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining. I love the fact that I have a heater and an air conditioner in my house where I can control my body temperature and actually be comfortable all the time and not having to freeze or be sweating like crazy in the summer. But the problem with this is when we have that constantly controlled temperature and our brains don't get that cooling sensation when it's nighttime, that means that our body is not going to get as much of a melatonin release. Now, one of the key things that helps you go to sleep is your body's melatonin release. And this is basically controlled by your body's circadian rhythm, or your 24-hour cycle of your body. And at nighttime, typically is when your melatonin will peak. And this will be a signal for your body to go to sleep. But another signal is also a drop in body temperature. So if you're not getting that drop in body temperature, you're not going to get as high of a peak of that melatonin release. So there is also a study done by some scientists to help us demonstrate our body temperature needs during the night. So they had people wear these whole body sleeping suits, and they're basically these wetsuits where these scientists could control the temperature by controlling the water flow in certain areas. So if they wanted to cool someone's feet or cool someone's hand, they could do that during the study. And what they found is by manipulating this wetsuit temperature and actually manipulating people's core body temperature, they were able to help people fall asleep faster and also stay asleep more throughout the night. So in this study, they actually showed a 20% improvement in people's ability to fall asleep in regular healthy people. And in elderly people who regularly struggle with falling asleep, they actually had an 18% improvement. And actually, I think the most impressive thing was in insomniac. So people who have insomnia are usually people who have trouble falling asleep and trouble staying asleep. By simply controlling their body temperature, they had a 25% increase in their ability to fall asleep. And another really impressive part of the study was people's ability to stay asleep throughout the night. So before the study, people had about a 58% probability of waking up in the later parts of the night and not being able to go back to sleep. But during the study, that plummeted to just 4%. So while they were controlling their body temperature, now they had hardly any chance of waking up during the night and struggling to go back to sleep. So you can see how big of a difference simply controlling your body temperature and controlling your thermostat can make. So if your thermostat is regularly around 70 degrees throughout the day, try turning it down to 65 a few nights and see if that improves your sleep. And luckily, there are other ways to help induce this dropping of your core body temperature that are a lot easier than wearing a wetsuit as well. And one of these ways is actually something that a lot of you might have already tried. It's simply taking a hot bath or a hot shower before you go to sleep. You might have felt like after you take a hot shower at night that you can fall asleep so easily because you're all warm and cozy. Well, you're right on one part that you can probably fall asleep faster and easier, but it's not because you're warm and cozy. It's actually because your body temperature is dropping. So once you take a really hot shower, what's happening is all of the blood vessels on the surface of your skin are dilating. And once you step out of that shower, those dilated blood vessels will start to radiate all of that excess heat from your body out. So all of that internal heat from your body is now being released, and you're going to have a rapid drop in your core body temperature. And there's actually studies showing exactly what can happen to your sleep when someone takes a hot bath or a hot shower before bed. And they found that taking a hot shower before bed can actually induce about 10 to 15% more deep NREM sleep during your nighttime. Now we talked a little bit about improving your sleep quality and a little bit about how you can stay asleep throughout the night and potentially sleep longer. But there are some other ways too that I want to talk about, and how you can actually start to sleep a full 8 hours every single night. A lot of people don't think it's possible for them to get a full 8 hours of sleep every night. And I don't really blame them, because I didn't think this was possible either for me. I thought the most amount of sleep I could get was about 6.5 hours for a long time. But you might be surprised that there's a lot of little things you can start doing to start increasing the amount of time that you're in bed sleeping. And those little things can not only increase the amount of time you're sleeping, but also improve your focus, improve your memory, improve your immune system, and all sorts of things to your body throughout the day. So one thing that's really important to understand when you're trying to sleep longer and trying to get those full 8 hours of sleep is controlling your circadian rhythm. Because you got to understand what exactly controls your sleep. There are two major things that control your sleep. The first is your circadian rhythm, which I'm going to get into. The second is a molecule called adenosine. Your adenosine is basically your body's sleep pressure, and is completely independent of your circadian rhythm. Basically, your adenosine will build up throughout the day the more you are awake. If you're awake for 24 hours straight, then your adenosine will have built up for those 24 hours. And it only goes away when you sleep it off. So once you go to sleep, then the adenosine will start to dissipate. On the other hand, your circadian rhythm is completely different and is controlled mainly by a hormone called melatonin. So your melatonin is something that will peak at nighttime. So one of the major things that will control your melatonin is sunlight. So when there is sunlight present, then your melatonin will drop. And when there's an absence of melatonin or no melatonin around in your brain, then it's going to be a signal for your body to wake up. But when your melatonin is peaking and there's a ton of melatonin in your brain, then that's a signal for your brain to go to sleep. So your melatonin will cycle through these 24-hour cycles where it'll peak at nighttime in response mainly to darkness, and then it'll drop during the daytime in response to sunlight. And even if you stay up for 24 hours straight, this melatonin will still go on this 24-hour cycle. It doesn't care how long you've been awake. So timing your sleep correctly in relation to your circadian rhythm will be super important if you want to start sleeping a full 8 hours. So one easy way to do that is to start going to sleep when you're tired. A lot of people have this problem where they're tired, let's say around 10 p.m., but they keep pushing themselves to stay awake until midnight or sometimes even after midnight by watching shows or watching something on their phone. And then they go to sleep and they find that they're awake at like 6 or 6:30 and they can't go back to sleep. And then they might wonder that, hey, maybe I only need 6 or 6.5 hours of sleep. The only problem is I'm still exhausted when I wake up. Well, this is the problem, because at 6 or 6:30, now your melatonin has dissipated because it has already gone through its 24-hour cycle, so that's a signal for your body to wake up. But those first 2 hours where your melatonin was peaking, you weren't taking advantage of that by going to sleep then. So it's really important to start going to sleep at a consistent time and go to sleep as soon as you're tired. Don't push it. Now, the second problem with that scenario is you're looking at your phone or a TV show. Now, the problem with looking at these screens before you go to bed is that they emit a lot of blue light. So light will go on different wavelengths and different frequencies, and our brain will respond differently depending on the type of light. So if we're seeing a blue light, this is really similar to the light that we're seeing throughout the day from sunlight. So if we're seeing a blue light from our phone or from a screen, this is going to be a signal to our brain that it's sunlight outside. And this is also going to be a signal to diminish our melatonin. So now not only are you pushing yourself to stay awake, you're now lowering the melatonin in your brain by staring at a screen or staring at a different type of blue light right before you want to go to sleep. So in a nutshell, the best way to control your circadian rhythm is going to be by exposing yourself to daylight during the daytime where the sun is actually out. And then when it comes to nighttime, only exposing yourself to darkness. So this is why I always give one tip to people if they have to wake up in the middle of the night and go to the bathroom, try to avoid turning the lights on. Because once you turn that light on, that's going to really diminish your melatonin and really make it harder for you to go back to sleep. So one way to do this is to get a small night light installed in your bathroom or something where you don't see it when you're sleeping, but if you have to go to the bathroom, you don't have to turn that light on so you don't get as much light exposure. Or you could just close your eyes and walk to the bathroom and then maybe sit down when you're peeing and hope that you don't create a mess or anything. That's another way to do it, but it's going to be better than turning that light on and making it harder for you to go back to sleep once you get back in bed. Now, another important thing you need to start doing if you want to sleep longer, and I already mentioned this a little bit, is be very consistent with when you're sleeping and when you're waking up. Now, this is going to be a really hard one for people, especially on the weekends, because a lot of people have to wake up early on the weekdays, but then on the weekends, we like to sleep later and then sleep in. But making sure you sleep at the same time and wake up at the same time is going to be one of the easiest ways to start improving your sleep and start to sleep longer. And we can already start to understand why, right? Because now we're controlling our circadian rhythm and we're not fluctuating our circadian rhythm. We're not fluctuating our melatonin release. But also, we're not fluctuating the amount of NREM and REM sleep we're getting. So our sleep is broken down into different stages. So it starts off as NREM or non-REM sleep, and then the last part of our sleep cycle is called REM sleep. So REM sleep is basically where a lot of our dreaming will occur, and it's called rapid eye movement, and it's characterized by our eyes darting back and forth. And our non-REM sleep is basically the opposite. It's where a lot of our deep sleep occurs, and it's also very important, but not as much dreaming will occur here. And one really interesting thing about our sleep is it's not even. So our NREM and our REM sleep distribution is not even throughout the night. So in the beginning hours of our sleep, we're going to get a lot more NREM sleep. But then in the later hours, those last 2 hours of our sleep, we're going to get a lot more REM sleep. Now, this is really important to understand because let's say that you typically sleep from midnight to 8 a.m. Those are your 8 hours of sleep, and that's where your circadian rhythm has always been working. But now you go to sleep 2 hours later, and you sleep at 2 a.m., and you wake up at 8 a.m. So you get 6 hours of sleep, but you cut out only those first 2 hours of your typical sleep cycle. You're going to be cutting out a whole lot of your NREM sleep, but not as much of your REM sleep. Now, at the same time, if you go to sleep at midnight, but now you have to wake up early and you wake up at 6 a.m. Now, you're not going to be cutting out an even amount of your NREM and your REM sleep. Just like before, you're going to be cutting out about 60 to 90% of your REM sleep by just simply waking up 2 hours earlier. Now, you might be wondering, why did our brains work like this? Why do our brains not just make an even amount of NREM and REM sleep? Because sometimes I can't sleep a full 8 hours at the regular times where I normally do. Well, part of the reason could be that this is just how our brains are processing new information and how our brains can store new information. Because our NREM and our REM sleep have very specific functions, and they're both extremely important for our memories. So our NREM sleep will sort of prune off new information. So we have all this information that's in our brain. Our NREM sleep will kind of act like a filter, and it'll filter out all the bad information, all the information that we don't really care about, and it'll focus more on the information that is more important to us. And then our REM sleep is really important for more general knowledge and more creative thinking. So both of these things are very important, but they come at different times. So you can see why sleeping at a consistent time is super important. Not just so that you can sleep a full 8 hours but also because you want to get enough of that NREM and that REM sleep. Now, another way to start sleeping longer is by making sure you're getting enough of your sleep opportunity time. So when someone says that they get 8 hours of sleep, what does that really mean? Does that mean that I go to bed at midnight, I immediately fall asleep, I wake up at 8 a.m., and boom, that's my 8 hours? Well, not necessarily, because in that scenario, you're not going to be sleeping 100% of the time. You probably realistically got 7 to 7.5 hours of sleep if you were in bed from midnight to 8 a.m. So your sleep opportunity time is super important if you want to increase the amount of hours that you're sleeping. That is basically the amount of time that you're actually actively trying to fall asleep and stay asleep. So again, you want to make sure that you're going to bed when you're tired and not forcing yourself to stay awake, especially by looking at those screens that are going to make it even harder for you to stay asleep. And the second thing you want to do is if you want to get 8 hours of sleep, you need to give yourself 8.5 hours to 9 hours of actual sleep opportunity time. So give yourself more time to actually try to fall asleep and stay asleep, because you know you're not going to be sleeping 100% of the time when you're in bed trying to sleep. Now, another common culprit in people not being able to sleep and not getting good sleep quality and not being able to stay asleep is something called an overactive sympathetic nervous system. So your sympathetic nervous system is basically, it's part of your body's autonomic nervous system. And your autonomic nervous system has two parts. It's your parasympathetic and your sympathetic. You might have heard of this from biology class or psychology class, but basically your sympathetic nervous system is your body's fight or flight response, and your parasympathetic nervous system is your body's rest and relax response. So if you have too much of your sympathetic nervous system, that means you're going to be way too anxious, way too stressed out, and always in this fight or flight mode. So the reason that our sympathetic nervous system got this name fight or flight is because back when we were hunter-gatherers, that's when our sympathetic nervous system would mainly be activated, when we were fighting off a predator or hunting for something or running. It's more of a tool for survival because our blood pressure will start to rise, our pupils will dilate, all these things will happen to our body that will help us in a situation where we need to fight off a predator or escape and survive. But the thing is that all of these changes will still happen in our body if we are chronically stressed or if we are anxious. So if you're trying to fall asleep and you're constantly being anxious and you're just lying in bed, then you want to try a couple things. So first of all, if you're laying in bed for over 20 minutes and you can't fall asleep, a good rule is to get out of bed and start doing something else until you feel tired, because otherwise you're just going to get more and more anxious and start looking at the clock and then really make it harder for you to go to sleep again. And another thing you can do is some sort of relaxation or something to help you calm down before you go to sleep. This is also something that you can try to do throughout the day too, where you just want to try to calm your body down and calm your brain down. So there's a lot of different breathing exercises you can do. I talked about some of those in a different video of mine, a different podcast, and I'm going to put a link to that in the description below if you're interested in that. You can also try taking hot showers or going on walks, spending time with nature, or if you like doing yoga, whatever it is, if there's something that helps you calm down and relax, make sure that you incorporate that as well, especially if you're trying to go to sleep. Now, you also want to make sure that you limit or cut out your alcohol and your caffeine. First of all, your caffeine or your coffee, there's studies showing that that will also spike your sympathetic nervous system. So that alone will make it harder for you to go to sleep. But your caffeine also causes a problem because it blocks your adenosine receptors. So we learned a little bit about this before, where your adenosine is a molecule that helps you go to sleep. It's basically your body's sleep pressure, and it builds up throughout the day the longer that you are awake. And this is one of the two signals that helps you go to sleep. And if you're drinking caffeine, then your caffeine is going to be blocking these adenosine receptors. So it's going to make you a lot less tired and harder for you to go to sleep. And there's actually studies showing that people who are drinking a lot of coffee, they'll mimic a lot of the symptoms of insomnia because this caffeine is making it harder for them to go to sleep and to stay asleep. And what happens is they actually start relying on this coffee more the next day because they didn't sleep so well. And then it turns into this never-ending cycle where they never really attribute their bad sleep to that caffeine. They always attribute it to something else. And also with alcohol, it does absolutely nothing good to your sleep. It's more of a sedative, so it'll help you fall asleep faster, but that quality of sleep will really suck. So first of all, it'll fragment your sleep, so you'll wake up more throughout the night. And it'll also prevent you from getting as much deep sleep. And you won't get as much of that REM sleep. So your sleep quality is going to be really terrible when you're drinking alcohol. Now, the last tip I have, if you want to start improving the amount of sleep that you're getting, is to start exercising. Now, there's a bunch of studies that we have that show the importance of exercise, and basically anybody who is more fit or physically fit than someone else, they're going to be much less likely to get different diseases. They're going to be at a much less likelihood of dying compared to the less fit person. But there's also a ton of evidence we have that simply exercising more throughout the day will improve your sleep and also improve your ability to fall asleep. So make sure you start incorporating an exercise routine as well. We know that sleep is important, but a lot of us do not realize how sleep affects our memory. And you might be surprised to find that sleep loss has been linked with memory disorders like Alzheimer's. And we have evidence that people get sleep disturbances several years before any symptoms of Alzheimer's. So that means